A twice convicted killer in Georgia is still alive today after a last-minute ruling stopped the state from putting him to death. Last night, officials said they'd already given the guy his last meal. That's when an appeals court stepped in and granted a temporary stay of execution. His attorneys and supporters argue the inmate is mentally disabled and executing him would violate the Constitution. Warren Hill murdered two people, his girlfriend back in the 1980s and a fellow inmate years later, whom he beat to death with a board filled with nails. The three state experts, I should say, who testified at trial that he was mentally fit now say that they were wrong about that. But Warren Hill is still not in the clear today. The Warren responsible for executing him has now asked the Supreme Court to step in and let him put the killer to death. Joining me now, criminal defense attorney Dan Conaway, who's live for us in Atlanta. And Dan's been following this case very closely, and he knows the law in Georgia very well, so we're happy to have him on. Dan, what did this appeals court do? What did they see as reason to stop the execution?
Well, what they're really looking at here, Harris, is the specific issue concerning his mental competency and whether, in fact, there's proof beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the Georgia standard, that he is in fact mentally retarded. And so they're looking at that, and they're going to look at that very carefully. And it's interesting that the 11th Circuit took this up because it's known, quite frankly, as a tough court. And at the same time, they are taking the time to look at this. So it's obviously something that they feel needs to be looked at before this final step is taken.
And that's the significance, the fact that they've been able to stop the process at all and that it would be that court that would do it. But you say that the stay is not going to last long. Why?
These types of stays normally only last about 30 days. Now, it could last longer than that, depending upon the amount of evidence that the Court of Appeals chooses to look at. And remember, in this situation, we have both the Georgia Court of Appeals and then also the 11th Circuit Court, the federal court, looking at it as well. And so ultimately there may be consolidation there as far as issues, as far as which court is going to look at what. And then ultimately they're going to have to review everything. And there's really evidence on both sides on this issue. There's evidence here to support the argument that defense cannot show beyond a reasonable doubt that this particular individual was mentally retarded.
How likely is it?
There's arguments on both sides.
Well, how likely is it, Dan, that the Supreme Court would listen to the warden's request now to step into this case?
Well, you know, they've already come down on not accepting it once. Now, on the other hand, depending upon what the 11th Circuit finds, they may choose to come back in again. At the same time, this is somewhat settled ground at this point. These cases were hotly argued back in the 1980s and the 1990s. The U.S. Supreme Court said in 2002 that mentally retarded individuals cannot, under the Constitution, be executed on the grounds of cruel and unusual punishment. But they left the legal standards for making these decisions up to the states. And in Georgia, the jury decides whether a person should be put to death. They have a separate trial, the death penalty phase they call it, where the jury, a jury of a person's peers, the defendant's peers, decides whether they should receive life or whether they should be declared mentally retarded or whether they should receive the death sentence. And so when they're looking at this, they're looking at it through the prism of what a jury of the defendant's peers already decided. So it's a very tough standard, in my opinion, for the appellant to meet.
Right. Mentally challenged Warren Hill. We'll see how long the stay lasts. You say it's normally about 30 days. We'll continue to follow the case. Dan Conaway, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.